testosterone, and they're going to trigger the production of the sperm themselves. They're going to set in motion for essentially the rest of the life of the male, the production of sperm. They're going to initiate the spermatogenesis cycle, and that cycle is going to be ongoing at various stages for different sperm for the rest of the man's life. This is very different than the triggering of development of oocytes and eggs in females, where there's an existing vault. That vault can be depleted to the point of zero where it can't occur again. Men can generate sperm their entire lifetime. Of course, there's a diminishment of sperm production in very, very late age, say 80s and 90s or 100s, but believe it or not, there's still sperm being produced. The quality of those sperm is another question. So everything we're going to talk about now is essentially puberty onward. Okay, prior to that, testicles are present, but they're not generating sperm. Ejaculation isn't possible, or if it is possible, it's very unlikely and unusual, and it's not going to contain sperm. Everything we're going to talk about now is puberty forward. Okay, so puberty onward to the rest of life. And luteinizing hormone secreted from the pituitary acts on the testes and on a very specific cell type in the testes called the Leydig cells, or Leydig cells, Leydig, the Leydig cells. The Leydig cells of the testes are what produce testosterone. Testosterone is going to have two major effects. And here I mean really major, because it has many, many hundreds of effects on different tissues of the body. In fact, that's the definition of a hormone, really. It's a substance that acts in an endocrine fashion. It can act on the very tissue that generated it. So for instance, testosterone made by the Leydig cells within the testes will act on the testes, as we'll talk about in a moment, but it can also act on other tissues. It can act on the pharynx and larynx and deepen the voice, as it does during puberty. It can act on the hair follicles and generate facial hair. It can act on the musculature and generate protein synthesis and development of muscle, bone, etc. Okay, all the things we associate with puberty and with testosterone typically. Restricting the conversation to the effects of testosterone on the testicle itself and on spermatogenesis, the Leydig cells make testosterone, and keep in mind that some of that testosterone will travel elsewhere in the body and do its thing for gene expression and the more acute effects of testosterone on the brain included. But the testosterone within the testes is at extremely high concentration. In fact, the concentration of intratesticular testosterone is at least 100 times higher than the concentration of testosterone anywhere else in the body, even though it's being secreted into the rest of the body. And that's because there are a number of different so-called binding proteins and enzymes that sequester the testosterone within the testes. So the Leydig cells are making testosterone. A lot of that testosterone is acting on and is restricted to the testes. And that turns out to be very important, because testosterone within the testes acts in concert with a different biological program that starts with FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that also travels to the testes and acts on a very specific set of cells that are called supporting cells, or more specifically, the Sertoli cells. The Sertoli cells are the cells that generate something called ABP, or androgen binding protein. And it is the combination of testosterone from the Leydig cells and ABP from the Sertoli cells that is necessary for spermatogenesis. It's necessary for those spermatocytes to become what will eventually be healthy, mature sperm that have really nice shaped oval heads, have a mid-region chock-a-block through mitochondria, and can generate a fast whipping motion of the tail to swim from the cervix or up the vagina to the cervix, and from the cervix to the egg to fertilize the egg. So it's really a basic set of chemical players that are involved here. And so basic, in fact, that if you were to disrupt any one of these chemical players, either the luteinizing hormone, the FSH, the testosterone from the Leydig cells, or androgen binding protein, you would observe pretty marked disruption in spermatogenesis, or the elimination of sperm entirely. We'll get into a few deficits in sperm development and sperm number and sperm function a little bit later, but just keep in mind, or I should say, maybe sit back and just appreciate that the exact same players, GnRH from the hypothalamus, which causes luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulated hormone release from the pituitary, which travels to the gonad, which in this case is the testicle, which triggers the release of testosterone from Leydig cells, which triggers the action of the supporting cells, the Sertoli cells, which make androgen binding protein. Testosterone and androgen binding protein combine and create a chemical and actually a structural milieu in which those little spermatocytes can go from the walls, from literally the walls of the tubes of those seminiferous tubules, can mature into healthy, well-developed sperm and can hop into those ducts, those little tubes, and then head off to the epididymis where they will reside. The epididymis is the tissue nearby the testicle or surrounding one portion of the testicle, and then eventually fuse with the vas deferens, can combine with or be contained with, rather, the seminal fluid, and then can be ejaculated via the urethra into the female, where then they can swim very quickly, effectively the distance for them anyway, from Los Angeles to San Francisco over the course of a very short period of time and fertilize the egg. So that's the process of spermatogenesis, the maturation of sperm, which is ongoing throughout the lifespan from puberty onward. And in doing so, we talked about some of the hormonal elements coming from the hypothalamus and coming from the pituitary, and within the testes themselves, the Leydig cells, which produce testosterone, the Sertoli cells, which are the support cells that allow spermatogenesis to occur. With that in mind, next I'd like to think about what's actually contained in the ejaculate in terms of numbers of sperm and what's really being selected for in terms of the sperm that actually successfully fertilizes the egg, and what sorts of elements come into play in dictating whether or not fertilization will or won't occur. And the major themes that we're going to discuss are frequency of ejaculation, but really that's just kind of a proxy for talking about maximizing sperm concentration and quality of sperm arriving at the egg, right? Because remember, ovulation and the menstrual cycle are really about creating the opportunity for fertilization, okay? And we are also going to talk about how the vaginal duct, the vagina, and the milieu around the cervix and some other elements within the female herself contribute to and support the sperm in their journey to the egg and in the likelihood that they will fertilize the egg. So really what we need to talk about first is sperm quality. And we should also probably talk about ejaculate quality, because as odd as that theme might seem, really the ejaculate quality, which has a number of different parameters, including the number of mature sperm that are not so mature that they're swimming slower or are dead, but also quality sperm that have, for instance, one tail. It's not entirely uncommon to see sperm with two tails, right? Because they just didn't form properly, or sperm that are not moving very much. In fact, sperm motility is scored along a scale of 0, 1, 2, or 3, 3 being the best, fast forward progressing. 0 is not moving at all. 1, they're actually called twitchers, right? Twitchers are sperm that sort of just twitch in place but don't undergo forward progression. 2 is somewhere in between 1 and 3, not surprisingly. Different clinics, different OBGYNs, different urologists will throw out different numbers, but in general, it is hoped that more than 50% of the sperm should be motile in some way or another, so not scoring a 0, but a 1, a 2, or ideally a 3. The concentration of sperm, of course, if it's higher within the ejaculate, the total number of sperm per milliliter of ejaculate, if that's higher, then there's a higher probability that one of those sperm will fertilize the egg. One thing I didn't mention before when discussing the production of eggs and ovulation, and I probably should have, so I will now, is that most often only one ovary gives rise to an ovulating egg, right? It happens, but it's somewhat rare for 2 mature eggs, one from each ovary, to be deployed during a single ovulation. There's a name for that when it occurs and both are fertilized. It's called fraternal twins. If a single egg, that of course comes from a single ovary, is fertilized and the egg splits, and that's something that happens further along the process of fertilization and differentiation of the embryo, well, then what you get are identical twins. Okay? There are other instances that are quite uncommon in which you can get fraternal twins through other circumstances, but in general, that's the way it works. But essentially what happens is one egg from one ovary. That's the most common occurrence. The sperm, once ejaculated into the vaginal duct, are going to pass through the cervix and then are going to swim toward the egg. The egg could be at varying locations along the female reproductive axis. Now, this is actually a very important thing and actually gets right down to the safety of both the potentially developing embryo and the mother. There is something referred to as ectopic pregnancy, and that's when the pregnancy actually occurs within the fallopian tubes. So the precise location in which fertilization between the